Hello, HR professionals and followers of Solving the People Puzzle. Welcome back to an episode on the pod. I am extremely excited to bring to you a guest that we had on in the previous season, Dr. Veldsman, all the way from the Netherlands. Dieter is a very well-known researcher, previous CHRO, and a big public HR voice in the HR community. And today we're going to be discussing research that they recently completed on 3 million HR professionals across multiple countries and organizations. And they uncovered the 5 HR major challenges that we are faced with at the moment. And we deep dive into these 5 trends, themes, whatever you want to call them, as well as some potential solutions for these. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. As always, give us a like, give us a follow, give us feedback, and share with anybody in your community that you believe could find this valuable. Thank you for following the journey and enjoy the episode. Well, thank you so much for being back. It's absolutely incredible to have you here. I did a deep dive into all our episodes in terms of the metrics and the stats, and our conversation from last year was by far one of the top performing episodes. So I guess I'm privileged and thankful to have you back. How have you been? Have you been good?
Yes, doing very well, thank you, and fantastic to be back with you, and glad that our previous conversation was helpful for people. So thanks for inviting me back.
Amazing, Dieter. So I think if we can dive straight into it, there's been a lot of research and a lot of conversations around the state of HR and where we're at as an industry, a fraternity, a group of humans trying to figure this out, especially in 2024 with everything that's going on. And I then stumbled across this incredible article that you guys released on literally that, the current state of HR and HR skills and where HR professionals are at. And, is there something we can do about it? And that immediately sparked interest for me. I know that our listeners will love this. So maybe if you can just kick us off around why this specific piece of research, and then we can get into the kind of the 5 highlighted elements and what to do with each of them.
No, thanks, Francois. And I think exactly to your point, what sparked the idea for the research was we talk a lot about the opportunities on the horizon for HR. And we've also spoken along the fact that it's a fantastic season to be within HR. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of transitions taking place. But we wanted to take a step back and say, what is our point of departure actually looking like at the moment? And what are some of the real barriers that we would have to cross in order to unlock the opportunities for the future? And that's what drove this particular project, to try and deep dive into practically what do we do now so that we are ready in the future. And that was really the questions that we tried to utilize to approach this particular project.
Amazing. And Dieter, tell me in the audience who was involved in the study?
So it was a bit of a multi-phase study. So we worked with a partner called Revelio Labs. Definitely want to encourage anybody to check them out. They're a workforce data organization.
Okay.
So they helped us with, from a big data point of view, we looked at more than 3 million HR profiles to say,
Wow.
What does the HR profile today look like? What skills are represented? How do people talk about their skill sets? And also, how do people move within the HR profession? Because I think it's one of the under-investigated areas is really
Yes.
HR careers.
Yes.
From there, we had kind of 850 people go through a competency-based assessment that we then put together to assess them against our T-shaped model. We had 350 people that went through a career survey that we then developed, and then 10 HR senior leadership career story interviews around understanding how did their careers unfold. And really insightful, I think, to combine that qualitative perspective around people's actual experience in the HR profession versus what the data was telling us. So quite a robust study with a lot of good people contributing towards the insight. So we're very happy about that.
That's incredible. Now, audience, we only have 20 odd minutes, so impossible for us to get all of that into this episode. But what I do promise is to, Dieter, if you can just share a link or anything valuable, we'll include that in the show notes for those HR geeks out there who want to deep dive into the data and go and check it out. But let's start. What is the current state?
I think, Francois, when I share what the current state is, I think it's important to view it through the lens of that it's a positive, good news story for HR in terms of where we're headed. But we have to be also realistic about where the profession is today. And there are some real challenges that we do need to look at. And we found 5 things that is really interesting for us. And the first one was something that intuitively we all know, but now we can put numbers to it, is around that organizations are under investing within HR. They're still very caught up in terms of, as the business grows, my HR function will lag. And what was really interesting
Mm.
was just to see that even in, call them enablement functions like marketing, finance, etc., HR is still underinvested even in terms of that particular area. So our question we ask there is, if you're expecting more of HR, you need to start investing in HR, and not just in terms
Sure.
of finance, but also in terms of by making sure that you have the right skill sets that sit there that is able to execute. So that was quite interesting for us. I did not expect how low the numbers would be. So we literally found that it's like a 2% investment within HR compared to like 7 and 9% in some of these other functions. And that's
Sure.
worrying in terms of, and it's not only about budget. So I think that was quite an interesting one around how are we equipping and enabling HR professionals. Second one that was really interesting for me was that even though in various organizations we are the champions of diversity, we actually have our own diversity dilemma within the current HR function. If you start looking at the profile from a demographic point of view around who the HR professional really is and what is represented. So we found almost 70%, and this was now based on the US side of the story, was really 70% is females. And that's
Yeah.
fantastic from a diversity point of view. But it also means that there's certain other implications in terms of how we think about the gender stereotypes pertaining to the profession and what the profession does and who is best suited for the profession, which I think is really interesting. It asks
Mm.
us questions around HR's reputation. It asks us questions around accessibility to HR careers. And a big one, which kind of links into the third one, is do people actually know what HR do? Because there's such a
Yes.
big mismatch in the skill sets that people list and say they are looking for. If we look at things like vacancies and job descriptions, etc., versus what people say they actually have and what they've developed. So there's this big mismatch that we found just between the skill set that people think good HR professionals need to have versus the skills that are actually helping them be successful in organizations. We also
Sorry,
found
Dieter,
kind of, yeah, go for it. Sorry, let
before you
me
continue,
let me
no,
don't
no,
go
no.
on and
I
on.
mean, loving this. I just quickly want to try and unpack the first two. So
Yeah, go for it.
if we're talking about representation and we're speaking about investment of both money and resources around development, I guess the first question becomes like why?
Hmm.
And did the data highlight specifically from the investment part, which is the first major challenge or issue or state? Did the research highlight any sort of insights around the why? Is it because of the perception that HR does not need investment? Is it because there is an issue around understanding the impact of HR, and so therefore, if your impact is low, then I'm not going to invest more because I'm not going to get a return on that investment?
Mm. I'm going to, it's a little bit of all of those, right? But I think one of the overarching things that was interesting for me is that a lot of business leaders still held a very traditional perspective around HR as a necessary evil in the organization. So it is still a very
Mm,
much a cost center driven mindset. So I know I need to have it. How can I get it at the cheapest possible rate?
yeah.
Having said that, though, we are also the victims of our own success because HR people typically step up, we go above and beyond, and we make things happen without any resources being in place. And then the business expectation is just, why do I need to invest in a learning function? You
You're
can
doing
do
it in
that,
any way.
surely.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And that kind of leads towards this terrible cycle that I don't know if I need it. And even if I then get it, I'm getting it at a cost of people burning out or not necessarily going into
Sure.
depth,
Sure.
around those different functions. And then your last point around value, there is also the perception around, what is the value that I get out of the HR function. And it was quite interesting also that beyond headcount, it was also related to things like HR technology, which was really interesting for me to find
Mm,
that people almost invest, and then at some point it reaches a bit of a plateau where they say, "But we have now invested. We've bought the system. Surely we are now okay."
yeah,
Forgetting, but the complexity of the organization is going to change, and that has to guide a little bit the way that we think about some of our future investments over time, which I
that's
think
super
is
interesting.
quite insightful. Yeah.
Yeah. I think on the second point, one of the first thoughts that comes to mind for me around female, the majority, I think you said
Mm-hmm.
70% on the US side of the research, is when I ask kids, I often get the opportunity to speak to HR classes. And, the typical question, why do you want to study HR? And then the answer is, well, because I want to work with people. And I
Yeah.
guess at some sort of level or lens, there's this assumption that, well, women are more emotional, and so therefore they have higher EQ, and because you're going
Yeah.
to be dealing with so much people stuff, women are more suited for the role. Did any of that come out of the research, or is that my own bias and conditioning?
That came out as a stereotype that is still very much held in a lot of places in the world, right? And I think what is interesting that you've already mentioned there is, we ask the question, do people want to be in HR when they grow up? Because nobody typically says, growing up, oh, I want a career in HR. So for a
Yes.
lot of people, they stumble into it. And then if we look at the typical backgrounds that people come from, it is kind of in more the sciences that are a little bit more orientated towards things like social sciences, psychology, oriented towards social work, education, etc. And those people
Admin, secretaries.
find their way into HR over time, and that plays, I think, a key role here. The
Mm,
other thing is also that it's a narrative that's out there, right? And I mean, I'm a male with a career in HR. I've faced kind of that bias from the other side quite a few times, right? Where there's this expectation that you are something that you are not. But the
sure.
role of HR is actually very, very different today than what it was a while ago. And I think that gender stereotype, and there's some terrible, I'm going to use the word, but please don't use it out of context. But HR sometimes is seen as a pink collar profession, where it's a feminine profession that a lot of people say, you ended up in HR because you could not do A, B, C, D, E, or F. And
Sure.
that's why certain people are attracted to the profession. And that's
Sure.
nonsense. The data tells us a different story, but the bias definitely exists,
Sure.
which I think is really interesting.
It is. And I guess that leads perfectly into the third point around the mismatch of skills and business requirements, right? Because now, we're pulling from a conditioning perspective, or at least a stereotype perspective, we're pulling individuals in there that might think to expect something else than what is required at the moment in 2024. And so all of a sudden we might then run into the scenario where there's a mismatch on a skills level.
Most definitely. And I think something we also found that, even when organizations go out into the market and say, I'm looking for an HR professional, the way they describe that is extremely generic. So one of the key findings was when we looked at it, you couldn't identify that it was an HR professional with HR skills when you look at kind of the rolled up data. When you go deeper,
Sure.
it starts becoming apparent. And then to your point, there we talk a lot about evidence-based and data-driven HR in the future, etc. But we need to then start incorporating those things within the HR skill set and in the way that HR professionals describe the skills that they have. So something
Sure.
that I think is very important for future is, do you know what your transferable skill set is as an HR professional? Because it's not HR, it's all the different components that lie beneath that. And that's the
Mm,
conversation that we do need to start having so people can understand what is it that HR brings to the table. Links
mm,
back to your earlier point around the misunderstanding of what the function is and what the function does. And we wrote something recently that talks about, we've got a reputation crisis and a PR problem in HR because we actually don't manage our reputation beyond the hire fire mentality that people still have. And as long as people think that's who we are, that's what they're going to expect. If a colleague
yeah.
of mine uses the example, which I really like, that says, if you want to find out what HR's reputation is, go and ask somebody that's an analytics specialist whether they want to sit in people analytics or in customer analytics, and they'll tell
Wow.
you the view around what they associate with the profession, even though it's the same skill set.
If we can practically just for the audience share some of those
Mm.
skills that are mismatched at the moment, Dieter, what came out from a requirement perspective or business perspective in relation to what individuals in the study did not have from a skills perspective or lacked?
Yeah, so there's definitely a big gap between the data literacy component. So, in terms of how do I utilize and work with data from an HR perspective. And here I'm not talking about the fact that everybody in HR needs to be a data scientist. I'm talking a lot more around that you understand and know how to utilize data as a core and as a foundation in how you work across the different HR perspectives in the value chain. There was linked to that a little bit more on the analytics side of things as well. How do I make sense and tell stories through data? How do I communicate and how do
Mm,
I drive business decision making? And maybe
mm,
something that was interesting, it wasn't necessarily lacking, was we saw a key trend around the fact that business acumen within HR professionals only starts being built later as they start moving up within the organization, which asks us the question, for the majority of people then within HR, there's a lacking skill set at the foundational level around business acumen and understanding the
yes.
business that I'm in. And then it kind of plateaus at a strategic level. So at very senior levels, it's not your business acumen that gets you ahead. It's very much your human skill sets there around how you navigate the organization, the complexities,
The
interpersonal
politics.
relationships, dealing with politics, which I think is interesting around how we prepare people for an HR career, because we typically think about the very functional technical skill sets. And I think we
Yes.
ignore sometimes some of these that make you a successful HR professional, not necessarily a successful talent acquisition professional. And I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
was quite interesting, in terms of what we found out of the study as well.
I also believe, and I've seen dealing with the vast majority of levels in HR departments that, and I mean, this might sound obvious, but I don't think there's an emphasis, especially from a development and an investment perspective on it, that the skill set starts changing the higher up
Mm.
you move in the value chain. And um, the link between career aspiration and wanting to get there, and then also understanding my own individual development plan in relation to that movement up, I don't think gets spoken about often, or at least gets brought to
Yeah.
the surface when we start talking career progression in HR.
Spot on. I think one of the key insights for me was that we don't talk about how the HR career progresses. And we are actually seeing, and this is my perception of this, I think we're going to face an HR leadership crisis in the coming years, because we find a lot of people, almost 40% of senior HR people, said they've got zero aspiration or ambition to become a chief HR officer. So they're comfortable
Sure.
with what they do, or they find that they feel stifled in the organization. So there's almost this exodus in a mid-career level that happens, where people say, politics, bureaucracy, this wasn't what I signed up for as HR, I don't get the necessary respect. I'm going to go and do something different. And then people shift and become, things like coaches supporting an organization, but they move out of the HR within the business type of
Mm, mm,
profession.
mm.
And that's a real crisis, and I think, to get back to the diversity component, we then also typically find what is interesting. You've got more males in HR leadership roles than females, even though the profession is dominated by, from a gender
Females.
point of view, females, etc. So that also then starts
Wow.
playing in, as that typical career unfolds. Your point around skills, I think we need to think very differently around skills across the life cycle over time.
Mm.
Because if that's not, going to be realistic for people, I think that there's a very big gap we're going to face, where either we have extremely strong technical HR people, or we have very strong business orientated HR people, but they don't have the technical know-how to really apply and do that translation.
Sure. Dieter, would this be a good time to quickly highlight to the audience your T model you spoke about?
Yeah, of course. So I think something that, and it didn't necessarily come out of this piece of research, kind of, it was validated by it as well. But, we talk about 5 core skills that we believe all HR professionals need to have, regardless of role or context. And that's business acumen, which we've spoken about, data literacy, digital agility. So how do I leverage technology and how do I operate with a digital mindset? We
Mm.
talk about people advocacy, which is very much around how do I build cultures of well-being and productivity? How do I manage people risk? And then execution excellence, which is, how do I show up as an HR professional, the
Yeah.
interpersonal side of things, navigation. That's then supplemented by the stem of the T, which is then what is my role and context in my organization, which is then the functional domains that we find, whether you're in awareness and attraction, or whether you work in engagement and performance. And then the last one, which we have actually added very recently, then is, if you are a leader in HR, what does that mean? What other additional skill sets do you need and do you require? Because it's quite a interesting dual role that you're playing as an HR leader. You're a leader of people. HR teams also need people, and they sometimes assume that people in HR know how to lead. It's not necessarily the
Correct.
case. And then on the
Yeah.
other side, you're the people leader in the business, which also has a very different implication. That's kind of
Yeah.
how we think about it in terms
Sure.
of development.
Fascinating. I want to double click on the one that I'm most comfortable and the most confronted with, and that's the digital agility. Um, we see on a daily basis as an HR tech service provider what a huge difference digital agility has on Whamly adoption,
Mm,
usage, Whamly growth, the utility of our platform, and I would 100% imagine it's exactly the same for any other HR tech that is introduced into the department and business, and you can clearly see adoption behavior patterns
mm,
and resistance, ambiguity, anxiety, uh, over sense of overwhelmment, and then at times, there is just this total ignorance around I'm not doing this,
mm,
and I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in that, where HR professionals, I think, understand that technology it's a non-negotiable, but then
yeah.
how I engage with it and I actually benefit from using it, and I empower myself and my success and that execution you spoke about at the very end through it is where an observed mismatch is happening at the moment at least from my perspective.
Yeah, you're spot on, right? So we found that. So if you think about digital agility, and I mean to put it in really simple terms, it's about mindset, skill set, and tool set. And sometimes we get very
Mm,
stuck on the tool set side of things. Do I know how to? And that's
yes.
typically only the bottom of the pyramid around. Do I use the tools? Do I know what is available? How do I adopt it? What we actually found that there's a lot of lack of confidence that a lot of HR professionals have in the utilization, which then also plays into the mindset of HR has to be perfect before we take stuff out. So it's not
Sure.
necessarily that natural. I experiment, I fail, I move forward. Honestly, I can't break this tool, so let me try and see what I can do with it and use
Yes.
it in any way
Yes.
possible. But that's not inherent to how we've kind of grown HR people over time. We've grown them very much around you have to be quality is important. Do things right first time. You have to be very, very efficient. And when
Attention
we
to
start thinking about
detail.
digital, exactly right, we want people that are more open to experimentation, very open to failure, see it as a learning and a part of the learning, and very, very open towards the fact that let me try and be curious about what this is. There's a lack of curiosity that I think we
Mm,
find within HR
mm,
professionals because we
mm.
care about our business, our process, what we need to do. And sometimes we forget that there's a curiosity about the bigger world that serves us well. And I think digital agility is very dependent on that.
Sure. Yeah. Dieter, bullet number 4, if I'm not mistaken, is a lack of confidence around critical business skills. Am I correct?
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of touches a little bit on what we've spoken about around digital agility, right? And I think there was just this notion there that, and I really want to say this categorically, which I found interesting. HR cares a lot about the business. That
Yeah.
misassumption we have around that it's only about the people. Most HR professionals actually have a very balanced view around that business needs to be successful so that people can be successful. And
Sure.
those two things are very
That's
intertwined.
good news.
Very good news, right? So I think we've drilled that in over the years that this is important. However, that's not translated that well, and that's where the lack of confidence piece comes in. So
Mm.
that articulation skill, that translation skill set that we find in HR to link to value, to link to impact. We've always spoken about the business, speaking the language of the business. It goes much deeper than that. It's just about you are the business as HR
Yeah.
as well. You're not something separate that sits
Yeah.
outside. And we found that quite a bit, that I think we sometimes have a bit of a self-image problem. Think about this now. I've mentioned this before. When people come into the executive boardroom from HR, you start, and I've did it myself in my career. You start, thank you so much for the time. I'm so glad that we can have this type of conversation. Nonsense. If any CFO started like that, you would kind of look at that individual
Yeah.
like this. But
Yeah.
we don't claim our space, and I think that legitimization of HR in the organization we need to do ourselves so that it can happen in other environments, and that's where that lack of confidence piece came in.
What do you think would be one indicator of the lack of confidence? Is it competence? Is it knowledge? Or is it a deep rooted foundational emotional problem that's part of the environment?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe we can talk about it from like there's, I think, external and internal stuff, right? So external is the history of the organization plays a role. What has HR always been here, and what has been the experiences thereof? So I think a lot of businesses haven't seen good HR, so then their
Mm,
expectation and the bar is pretty low, which is fantastic in terms of what you can do for them. What's really difficult there is you kind of have to carve out the road first around that you should be
break down
involved
that
in certain
conditioning.
things and break that down. So I think externally we find that a good way to test that is go and check where, if at all, on the executive agenda, the HR topics get discussed. It's usually pretty late in the agenda, just before the end, 5 minutes for this. And then people ask the question, but why don't we know more in depth what's happening in the business, right? So I think that's the one
Good
side.
point.
Internal, to your point, I think the confidence thing also comes a little bit around HR, and that's also came out of the research, is a tough gig, right? People love it, but it's a really tough profession. So sometimes I think people don't stand up enough
Mm.
for who the HR professional is because you're so conditioned that it's all about the other people around the HR professional. It's not, you also have to claim your space. And I think that's important.
I remember in reading the article, one of the things that stood out for me that I didn't know was the low percentage of individuals entering HR as their first job. And
Wow.
and so from a confidence perspective, if I stumble into this
Hmm.
accidental profession, there's almost a lack of proactive initiative and intent to go, I'm the next Dieter, and this is my mission, and I know exactly why I'm here, and it's like this reactive wheel that's just turning,
Mm.
and then eventually you end up in the boardroom and you go, oh, thank goodness for making time for me. Yeah, I don't know what I'm, how did I land up here? And I mean, it's yes, it goes so deep. The awareness of the profession, our opportunity, which I see as a good thing, to really circle back to where it all starts, call it tertiary institutions or whatever sort of awareness
Mm.
platforms we want to use, to really solidify and create awareness around what the hell this thing is, and the
Mm.
opportunities in here, and that it isn't easy. It's not the I couldn't make it in the first rugby team, I hurt my knee, and so I'm going into HR.
Yeah.
No, we should be attracting really smart individuals who choose between engineering and HR and then purposefully decides, now I want to go into human capital.
And spot on. I mean, we found only 8% of people actually enter the HR profession as their first job.
Wow.
Everybody starts somewhere else and then kind of find their way in, which, there's benefits in that there's diversity in the skill that people bring. But to your point, I think if we choose something, we are typically a lot more proud about what we achieve within that domain. So, so how do we get people to just love the profession and what the profession is? I still speak to a lot of HR professionals. When you in the social setting, and I ask you, so what do you do? Nobody wants to say, oh, I'm in HR.
Yeah.
I'm in, and then we use a list of different elements. So there's something around the how the profession is perceived. Are people proud to be part of it? Do they really have that that desire? Because the people do have once they're in it, but it kind of doesn't feel that way when people make the
Mm,
decision to move into HR. And
mm,
the
mm.
words you used around, everybody used that in the interviews, especially. I kind of just stumbled into the profession. Oh, it became part of my role, or there was an opportunity, or I was in a project, and then this looked interesting, and then I shifted into that. And we need to structure that baseline level of what happens at the beginning of an HR career a lot better if we're going to build a foundational standard skill
Yes.
set over time. But to your point, grassroots need to play a role. If I ask somebody, when you grow up, do you want to be in HR? I would love at least, maybe like 1 out of 20 to say, yes, that's what I want to
Yes.
choose, as
Exactly.
opposed to, everybody chooses other things or then land in HR because they didn't have other options.
And then our fifth challenge.
That was around the career piece, right? In terms of that, there's some tension between how HR careers are playing out and what organizations do. So we know that there's not a lot of attention paid to the HR career specifically. I mean, even in the
Mm,
research, there's very little on that. And we found two interesting things there. The first one is most HR professionals don't know what an HR career could entail for them. So they base it on what they've seen, right? So I was in a small business, so I assume if I'm an HR consultant, I need to become an HR business partner, and then maybe I become an HR manager, and that's my perception of an HR career. Or we don't necessarily help people understand what the practical steps are that they can take to actually shift and move between different domains and areas of HR. So my point earlier around that transferability of the skill is so
mm,
important.
mm.
In terms of us just getting that piece right. A lot of work, and we're shifting our focus there quite a bit now, is around how do HR careers actually develop, and how can we just mandate and help people think differently about their own development in that regard. It goes beyond training, right? But I think,
Yeah.
the study spoke about the fact that people actually have very low career satisfaction in HR, which is also, a worrying factor because it is such an important part of a healthy organization. And it all
Sure.
has to do with, why do you get into HR? Is it delivering on that expectation? And are you enabled and equipped in an organization with the environment to move around and actually build a meaningful career?
I guess it's fair to say that the demand for it is not shrinking, and so therefore there is this landscape and opportunity for HR professionals to step in and I almost want to use the word manifest in that space. If the demand was going down, the research would indicate that in 5 years' time, we won't have an HR department, right? We'll
Mm.
have industrial engineers, industrial psychologists, and systems. But I did not pick that up from the research. The demand for an HR function, it's there, at least for the time being, right?
Definitely. HR is actually one of the fastest growing professions at the moment. And that's something we never talk about because all we talk about is how AI is going to replace the administrative HR.
Mm,
Points again towards the reputation piece. But to your point, if we can really help people understand what the different things are that is available within HR and how some of that is actually increasing in importance going forward. I think you can create that burning platform that people then says, but that's what I want to do. I always
Mm.
knew it, but I just didn't have words for it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but we do need to dispel, some of the myths that I've spoken about already, and change the narrative around. Oh, I hate HR. Why do we hate HR? And rather shift that a lot more towards the fact that how can we contribute differently in a different work environment, and what other opportunities does that unlock? And then let's just be super practical about that. Let's not be theoretical about what that's going to look like and say it means 1, 2, 3, 4 for me over the next couple of months, years,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. If I can put you on the spot, Dieter, we're nearing the end of the episode. From a solutions or setting us up for success in the future perspective, what are a couple of thoughts or ideas that came from the research around what we can now do, that maybe could excite the audience, or it's something different than,
Mm.
well, we need to reskill or upskill? I mean, everybody's
Yeah.
talking about reskilling and upskilling, and I'm not too sure if anybody's doing it. It's part of all the trends and all the research. Reskill, upskill, reskill for retention. Okay, great. What does that mean? Any kind of
Yeah.
highlights from the research around? Okay, there's hope.
On the one side, organizational level, I think legitimize the function, educate people on what it is, and make sure that
Yes.
it sits in the right place and gets the necessary attention. So that's almost like if we were starting out, what is the real business case for an HR profession? I'm not talking about it only in your own organization, but I think that's a core component that we need to work together on collectively, because I think that definitely has to change. The second one is change the narrative on how we talk about HR, and that has to start with ourselves as HR professionals, because we sometimes talk very
Love.
demeaning about our own profession. Rekindle the pride in the profession that we have as individuals, because I think if you're not proud about this and you're not enthusiastic, nobody's going to then make you reskill at all, because it's not going to be a priority. And the last one is we need, and it's something that we didn't touch on today, but HR is a lonely profession that a lot of people also
Sure.
mentioned. We need to build a global HR community that is between different organizations that can support each other along this particular journey, because HR
Yeah.
finds they don't feel like they belong in an organization because I'm always separate. I'm always dealing with the
Yes.
stuff that I can't talk about.
Yes.
So how can we create that community in different ways for people to be supported throughout their career? Because a lot of the things we've mentioned now, I think, just also originates from the fact that people don't feel like they belong. I think in HR, you're going to belong to a profession and a community beyond just thinking that you belong in one organization at the
In one
particular
logo.
point. So I think
I
that's
would I would
important.
love to double click on that for a second. So apart from Solving the People Puzzle podcast, we have another initiative at WAMNY called the HR Roundtable. We started this after you and I had our first episode, where once a month I go for dinner with 10 HR professionals, senior
Hmm.
HR execs, talent manager,
Awesome.
and and it always ends up being a 4-5 hour conversation, and it's this, and then from there they go into this private WhatsApp group, and we have about
Hmm.
70 odd in there already, and it has been
Awesome.
phenomenal to see how the HR professionals in South Africa now, where we're doing this, are just loving this safe platform to engage with each other regardless of my logo,
Hmm.
and the sharing and the vulnerability and the being human, just it's phenomenal. And so I completely agree with you. We're physically seeing that happening in that space, where this need for community and the responsibility that we all have to create these platforms, I 100% agree with you, is definitely something that can help with some of these challenges.
Yeah, that's an awesome initiative. I think HR, in my view, is a very giving community. So, it sometimes feels a little bit like nobody ever asked, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
and I think just sometimes to get some context from other people that, to use your words, regardless of logo, that other people are experiencing similar type of things.
Mm.
To make it practical, something I loved was I was on part of a local SA community during COVID when I was CHRO, where actually we were a whole bunch of CHROs that got together once a week during the crisis time just to talk about what are you doing about this?
Brilliant.
How are you implementing this? And I've never learned so much in my life as opposed to those conversations, an hour a week, over a couple of months, just because I felt for the very first time somebody that is in a similar position is also sharing,
Yeah,
things that I did not necessarily know. So I think there's a lot of value in that
a lot.
social learning aspect and that social connection aspect that we need to drive a little bit more intentionally.
Amazing. Dieter, well, thank you from all of us here in South Africa and the larger HR community and the listeners for all the incredible work that you are doing over there in Europe. And thank you for your time today, your wisdom, your insights. As I said in the beginning of the episode, audience, I will share those in the footnotes links to some of the research and the trends that we spoke about. Dieter, thank you so much. As always, it's been an incredible pleasure having you on the episode.
Thanks so much for having me, and always fun to collaborate on these. So thank you very much.